You think you know the Victorian vampire. You picture Dracula, perhaps a shadowy figure with a cape, fangs glinting in candlelight, a creature of pure Gothic fiction, rather romantic in its own macabre way. But what if I told you that in a supposedly enlightened era of scientific marvels and industrial progress, entire British communities were utterly convinced they faced a horrifying, real vampire epidemic? Because the true horror wasn't lurking in some remote Transylvanian castle. It was festering right here in the drawing rooms and graveyards of Great Britain, and it was absolutely terrifying. This story took place in Victorian Britain, a society grappling with rapid industrialization and scientific marvels, yet paradoxically gripped by a vampire epidemic that forced ordinary, respectable people to confront their deepest fears of disease, death, and the unseen forces that seemed to stalk their very homes. We'll delve into the grim reality behind the myth, revealing not only the shocking historical evidence that fueled these panics, but also the gruesome, desperate measures communities resorted to, genuinely believing they were battling the literal undead. And by the end, you'll understand why the most chilling vampire of all was not a creature of folklore, but an equally stealthy, very real villain that even the most rational Victorian minds couldn't fathom. To truly grasp this epidemic, you must first understand the fascinating paradox of Victorian society. A world where telegraphs and steam engines coexisted with deep-seated superstition, where the rigid veneer of propriety often masked a profound anxiety about disease, decay, and the ever-present shadow of mortality. So, if those ornate killing kits you might have heard of weren't actually for slaying real vampires, what were they for? And what was the true horror that haunted Victorian Britain with such merciless persistence? Picture yourself wandering through an antique shop or museum, and there it is. An exquisite wooden box lined with velvet, containing a silver crucifix, a small pistol, wooden stakes, and various bottles of mysterious powders. The placard reads, "Victorian Vampire Killing Kit, circa 1880. Rather thrilling, isn't it? Well, I hate to break it to you, but you're looking at what museum curators and historians now conclusively recognize as almost entirely 20th century fabrications. These elaborate kits, while often assembled from genuine Victorian components, were created well after the Hammer horror film era, typically post-1960s, to capitalize on our modern fascination with the undead. The anachronisms are rather telling once you know what to look for. Silver bullets, for instance, were traditionally associated with werewolves, not vampires. The pistols included would have been utterly useless against creatures that folklore insisted could only be killed by very specific methods. It's rather like finding a medieval knight's armor, complete with a zip fastener. Impressive until you spot the glaring historical impossibility. But here's what makes this fascinating. These fake kits tap into something very real about Victorian Britain's relationship with the macabre. The Gothic literary movement was absolutely thriving, you see. John William Polidori's The Vampire in 1819 had introduced the sophisticated, aristocratic vampire, quite different from the crude, folkloric creatures of earlier centuries. Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla in 1872 further refined this elegant monster. The theatrical world embraced these creatures with remarkable enthusiasm. Stage adaptations of The Vampire used primitive special effects to make vampires appear and vanish, thrilling audiences with their supernatural abilities. These theatrical conventions, the dramatic cape, the pale complexion, the mesmerizing gaze, were establishing the vampire's visual language decades before cinema took over the job. The popular press fed this appetite voraciously. Penny dreadfuls with lurid titles like Varney the Vampire serialized bloodthirsty tales week after week, while sensationalist newspapers reported on strange deaths and mysterious phenomena, sometimes with distinctly supernatural undertones. But if these elaborate tools were pure fantasy, how do we know Victorians were so utterly convinced that vampires were real? The answer lies not in a dusty box of theatrical props, but in the unseen horror that was truly devastating their homes and families, one by one, with ruthless efficiency. You are a respectable Victorian family, living in one of those terraced houses that speak of modest prosperity and social aspirations. Then consumption arrives at your door like an uninvited guest who simply refuses to leave. Tuberculosis, known to Victorians as the Great White Plague, or, in the chilling words of one physician, captain of all these men of death, was decimating British families with relentless precision. But it wasn't the swift, merciful killer that, say, cholera could be. No, consumption was far more insidious, far more psychologically devastating. Picture helplessly watching your child slowly waste away over months. Their once rosy cheeks become pale as parchment. Their eyes sink deep into their skull, and they develop an almost ethereal, otherworldly appearance. They suffer violent night sweats, cough up blood with alarming regularity, and seem to be literally fading before your eyes, as if something invisible was slowly draining their very life force. The symptoms were strikingly, unnervingly similar to what folklore described as vampire attacks. The victim grows pale and weak, develops an aversion to sunlight, suffers from mysterious wasting, and appears to be consumed from within by some malevolent force. Rather like watching someone slowly dissolve, really. But here's where it becomes truly terrifying. Tuberculosis often moved through families in sequence. First, your daughter succumbs, then perhaps your youngest son begins showing the same symptoms, followed by your wife. To a grieving Victorian family, watching this progression unfold, it appeared as though the recently deceased were somehow returning to claim their living relatives. Without germ theory, which wouldn't be properly understood until the 1880s, supernatural explanations weren't just logical, they were the only explanations that made any sense. What else could account for this invisible force that seemed to follow the dead, targeting those who had been closest to them in life? Imagine watching your family succumb, one by one, to this insidious disease with no scientific explanation available to your rational mind. Where else could you turn but to the ancient, terrifying whispers of the restless dead? Now, you might think that vampire folklore was somehow foreign to British soil. All those Eastern European legends, continental superstitions. But Britain had its own rich, deeply rooted tradition of the walking dead. Thank you very much. Long before Dracula set foot in Whitby, British folklore was populated with revenants, ghouls and barguests, unquiet corpses that returned from their graves to spread misfortune, illness, or worse, among the living. These weren't the sophisticated vampires of Gothic literature. They were far more primitive, terrifying creatures driven by unfinished business or improper burial rites. Medieval and early modern Britain has documented cases of what historians call deviant burials, corpses buried face down, weighted with stones, or staked through the heart to prevent them from rising. These weren't isolated incidents of superstition. They were systematic responses to genuine community fears about the restless dead. The sudden collapse of rational thought in the face of unexplained family deaths was much like a British summer barbecue. Starts with confidence, then suddenly, you're running from rain. But in primal terror and grasping for any explanation that might make sense. The popular press naturally exploited these fears with gleeful abandon. Penny dreadfuls reported strange deaths with distinctly supernatural overtones, while newspapers occasionally hinted at dark forces at work when medical explanations proved inadequate. Even reports from across the Atlantic, tales of vampire panics in New England, where families were exhuming relatives suspected of causing consumption, filtered into British consciousness, amplifying existing anxieties. When your rational, scientific worldview fails to explain why your loved ones are dying in such a horrific, sequential manner, the ancient whispers of folklore begin to sound remarkably reasonable. So the stage was set. A devastating disease that medical science couldn't yet explain, deep-rooted cultural fears about the restless dead, and a popular press that delighted in feeding the public's appetite for the macabre. But how did these fears manifest in the grim reality of Victorian graveyards? The frantic scramble to protect families from the supernatural wasn't so different from the last drinks rush on a Friday night at the pub. Everyone desperate to get what they wanted before it was too late. Propriety be damned. While Victorian record-keeping was often discreetly silent about such matters, hardly the sort of thing respectable families wanted documented, there are compelling accounts of suspicious nocturnal activities in British churchyards. Graves disturbed without apparent motive for robbery, coffins found repositioned or damaged, and whispered stories of families taking desperate measures to put their dead to rest. The practices, when they occurred, followed ancient patterns: stakes driven through the heart, decapitation, removal and burning of organs, or simply turning the corpse face down to prevent it from finding its way out of the grave. These weren't acts of malice or madness. They were the desperate responses of terrified people who genuinely believed they were protecting their surviving family members from supernatural predation. Local doctors and authorities found themselves in impossible positions. Publicly, they maintained scientific rationality and discouraged such practices. Privately, faced with grieving families convinced that their deceased relatives were somehow responsible for ongoing deaths, they sometimes turned a blind eye to nocturnal disturbances in local churchyards. One particularly telling account from a Yorkshire parish record, discreetly noted by a local vicar, mentions a family who took measures to ensure the peaceful rest of their departed, after 3 more family members also fell ill with consumption, following a young woman's death. The euphemistic language barely conceals what was almost certainly an unauthorized exhumation and ritual. The tragedy wasn't in the superstition itself, but in the sheer desperation that drove ordinary, respectable people to commit such acts against their own beloved dead. These were not acts of malice, but of terror. Parents trying to save their remaining children by any means available to them. But even as fear gripped communities across Britain, another powerful force was quietly at work, one that would eventually transform our understanding of disease, death, and the monsters that haunt our collective imagination. Here's the revelation that changes everything. The vampire epidemic of Victorian Britain wasn't ended by stakes or silver bullets. It was conquered by something far more powerful and ultimately more revolutionary: the gradual, inexorable triumph of germ theory. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, pioneering medical researchers like Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur were methodically unraveling the true nature of infectious disease. The terrifying, invisible force that seemed to stalk families wasn't supernatural at all. It was microscopic. The monster that had haunted British homes for generations was revealed to be Mycobacterium tuberculosis, a tiny bacillus that could be studied, understood, and eventually defeated. This scientific revolution stripped the vampire of its terrifying, real-world power almost overnight. What had been a genuine, physical threat, something that required desperate measures like grave desecration and ritual staking, was suddenly transformed back into what it had always been, a psychological manifestation of our deepest fears about disease and death. But here's the delicious irony. As the real-world vampire threat receded, the literary vampire flourished as never before. With families no longer genuinely terrified of their deceased relatives rising from the grave, authors like Bram Stoker could create the sophisticated Count Dracula in 1897, a character who embodied Victorian anxieties about foreignness, immigration, and social decay, but who was safely contained within the realm of fiction. Stoker's Dracula became the foundational text for our modern vampire mythology, precisely because it arrived at the perfect moment, when the scientific understanding of disease had made real vampires impossible. But the cultural memory of that terror remained vivid enough to make fictional vampires absolutely thrilling. The stage adaptations that followed, particularly Hamilton Dean's 1924 production, visually codified the vampire for mass audiences. The evening dress, the dramatic cape, the aristocratic bearing. These theatrical conventions established the vampire's enduring image, transforming what had once been a source of genuine community terror into entertainment. The shocking truth is that the vampire epidemic was never really about vampires at all. It was a poignant, terrifying chapter in the eternal human struggle between ignorance and knowledge, between our need to explain the inexplicable and our gradual understanding of the natural world. The epidemic was real, but the monster was a microscopic organism that no amount of stakes or crucifixes could touch. Victorian Britain, a nation of gas lamps and railway timetables, of scientific discovery and industrial progress, found itself haunted not by creatures of the night, but by the relentless march of disease and the terrifying echoes of ancient fears. The vampire epidemic was a tragic testament to humanity's desperate need to explain the inexplicable, to fight monsters, even when those monsters were invisible, microscopic, and tragically misunderstood. It was a time when folklore truly became a terrifying reality, when the boundary between superstition and genuine threat dissolved completely. Families destroyed by consumption turned to methods that were ancient when Britain was young, driven by love, desperation, and the simple human need to do something, anything, in the face of inexplicable loss. The legacy of this dark chapter continues to chill us today. Not because we fear vampires, but because it reminds us how easily rational minds can be overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their understanding. Rather makes you appreciate your morning cup of tea and the simple comfort of scientific knowledge, doesn't it? Far less likely to drive you to midnight excursions in the local churchyard. What does this dark chapter in British history tell us about our own fears, and how readily we might turn to supernatural explanations when faced with the truly unknown? Share your thoughts below. Which historical monster do you think was born from a similar terrifying reality? If you dared to delve into the shadows of history with us, stake out that like button and subscribe to the channel for more unsettling journeys into the past. Don't let your curiosity fade into the night.